Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Argentina. It's been a little while since we last talked about Argentina, and unfortunately things have got progressively worse. And inflation in September is now above 138%. And in order to try to tackle that inflation, interest rates have been increased to 133%. These figures are completely off the scale. When we were talking about the crisis in the USA and Europe, we were talking about inflation hitting 9, 10, 11%, being extremely worrying. So when you've got inflation at 138%, that is a completely different ball game. And the situation in Argentina has got so bad that the current president has basically said, I'm not interested in running for re-election. I don't want to do this anymore. It's an impossible task. And the new presidential election is taking place on Sunday the 22nd of October. So by the end of October there will be a new president in Argentina. And the current frontrunner in the election polls is a guy called Javier Milei, who's been referred to as the Donald Trump of Argentina. And he's come up with some quite radical policies which include scrapping the Argentine peso and moving wholesale to the US dollar, which quite frankly is happening on the streets of Argentina anyway. The vast majority of Argentinians are happier using the US dollar currently because the value of the peso is falling so rapidly. He also wants to scrap the central bank, introduce more relaxed gun rules and tighter rules on abortion. So lots of controversial policies. So in today's video, we'll have a look at the presidential race and have a look at the three candidates that are running. We'll talk about what's going on with inflation, interest rates and the Argentine peso. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen to Argentina's economy over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everybody that's bought me a coffee and sent me a YouTube super thanks. I really appreciate it. It does mean a lot to me. And if you would like to support the channel and see some more face-to-face videos that I'm not posting on YouTube and also find a way of avoiding all of the ads, then please check out my Patreon channel. However, if you don't like Patreon and you'd like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to buy me a coffee and YouTube super thanks and also YouTube's membership scheme.
Argentines are set to vote in presidential elections on Sunday, a decision that could send the country into a political unknown. Radical outsider libertarian Javier Milei has made himself the candidate to beat. The 52-year-old poster child of voter anger is up against economy minister Sergio Massa and conservative Patricia Bullrich, once pegged as the favorite to win, but now fighting to stay in the race. Regardless of who wins, the next government will have to deal with a gargantuan pile of debt and a weak peso. The electorate has little trust in Argentina's currency, and the country has been engulfed in a deep financial crisis involving runaway inflation that may hit 200% this year. Many have latched onto Milei's burn-it-all-down rhetoric. His proposals include dollarizing the economy, ending currency controls, closing the central bank, and cutting spending sharply. He also favors lax gun controls and tighter rules on abortion. That contrasts with Argentina's 51-year-old economy minister Sergio Massa, who has built up a reputation as a pragmatist and negotiator. He was drafted into his current role last year to turn around the economic crisis, but has struggled to rein in inflation and halt the sliding peso, though he has gained ground with popular tax cuts. Meanwhile, 67-year-old Bullrich, a former security minister, has made promises of economic stability and is running on a tough-on-crime platform. A candidate needs 45% of the vote, or 40%, with a 10-point lead over second place, to win outright on Sunday. Pollsters generally agree the most likely result is that Milei comes first, but will face a second-round vote with Massa in November. But with polls having proven unreliable for the August primary, no one should be ruling out another surprise.
This chart shows the movement in the rate of inflation in Argentina over the course of the last 12 months. And one thing to note about this chart is the scale on the right-hand side, which doesn't start at 0. It actually starts at 80% and goes up to 140%. And when you've got an inflation chart starting at 80%, you know you are in deep trouble. In October 2022, the official rate of inflation in Argentina was 88%, which meant that at that time Argentina had the highest rate of inflation out of any country in the G20, the 20 largest economies in the world. And in fact, 88% put Argentina in the top 5 economies in the whole world. However, as you can see from this chart, over the last 12 months, things have got progressively worse. Inflation continued to rise through the end of 2022 and the start of 2023 and passed 100% in February, 110% in May, 120% in August, and the current rate of inflation for September 2023 is 138%. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, is this really big news? Because Argentina's always had a very high rate of inflation. However, if we expand the scale of this chart out to show what's been happening over the last 25 years, you can see that the current rates of inflation are off the scale compared to what Argentina has experienced historically. Apart from a relatively brief period in 2003, inflation in the noughties was broadly around 10%, and it remained around that level until 2014. Between 2014 and 2019, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation did start to increase and rose to around 60% in 2019. Inflation then fell back to less than 40% during the pandemic. However, from 2021 onwards, it has skyrocketed to the current level of 138%. And to put that into perspective, this chart shows the latest inflation rates for the G20. And as you can see, Argentina is right at the top of this list. The only other country that's in double figures currently is Turkey, where inflation has started rising again and is now sitting at around 62%. And the next highest ranked countries are the United Kingdom at 6.7%, Australia and Russia at 6%, South Africa at 5.4%, Italy 5.3%, Brazil 5.2%, and India at 5%. Every other country in the G20 currently has inflation of less than 5%. And this chart ranks the current rate of inflation for every country in the world. And you can see that Argentina now has the third highest rate of inflation. The only two countries with higher rates of inflation are Venezuela, which has been under severe sanctions since 2019, despite having the largest oil reserves in the world. And inflation in Argentina is currently at 318%. And Lebanon, which is still suffering from the effects of the civil war, which destroyed the economy, where inflation is 230%. The next highest ranked country after Argentina is Sudan at 63%, Turkey 62%, Suriname 54%, and Sierra Leone at 51%. And when you look at the remaining names on this list of country, which include Cuba, Haiti, Iran, Ghana, Egypt, Congo, Pakistan, and Ethiopia, it really puts into perspective just how severe the problem is in Argentina right now, because the common theme amongst all of these countries is that they are in a state of economic collapse. And this chart shows the movement in the price of food over the last 12 months in Argentina. And this is a metric that we always like to look at on the channel because food prices are indiscriminate. Everybody has to buy food, whether you're rich or poor, but the poorest members of society are spending a much higher percentage of their budget on food. So when food prices are increasing, it disproportionately affects those poorer families and means in many cases that they just can't afford to buy as much food. And that's when we get serious problems in society, when people can't afford to put enough food on the table to feed their families. And once again here on the right hand side of this chart, we've got a scale that does not start at 0. The bottom of this chart is 80% and the top is 160%. And what you can see here is a very similar trend to what we just looked at for general inflation. However, in many of these months, the level of food inflation is actually higher than it was for general inflation. In October 22, food prices increased year on year by 92%. They continued increasing in every month and passed the 100% level in February, went above 110% in April, hit 133% in August, and the current rate of food inflation for September 2023 is over 150%. So what that means is that the amount of food that you could buy for $1 12 months ago would cost you more than $2.50 today. And to put the current levels of food price inflation into perspective, this chart shows the movement over the last 5 years. And you can see that food inflation has definitely been a problem in Argentina for a long time. 5 years ago, prices were rising by around 20%. And when you compare that to the crisis that we've been talking about in the Western world, where inflation has hit double digits, 10%, it really helps to give you clarity on the problems in Argentina. Prior to the pandemic, food price increases had got up to around 60%, which is very, very high. Between 2019 and 2022, food prices increased by somewhere between 40 and 60%. However, over the course of the last 18 months, food prices have taken off, and the current level of 150% represents an absolute crisis, and there are people in Argentina right now who can't afford to put enough food on the table for their families. The vast majority of economies use interest rates as an important tool to try to control inflation. And classic economic theory tells you that when inflation starts to rise, you should increase interest rates, because increasing interest rates makes borrowing more expensive and therefore discourages people from taking on new loans, and in many cases, existing loans increase in cost. And that usually means that both individuals and companies have less spare cash, and therefore they will spend less. That means a reduction in demand, and when demand goes down, generally prices follow. And you can see from this chart that over the last 12 months, Argentina have been following that theory and increasing their interest rates. And as with the previous graphs that we've looked at, the scale on the right-hand side of this chart does not start at 0. In fact, it starts at 60% and rises to 140%. And just to remind you, this is interest rates that we're talking about. This time last year, the official rate of interest in Argentina was 75%, which meant that if you wanted to take a loan out, you would be paying at least 75% interest every single year. That is crazy. However, as you can see from this chart, over the last 12 months, interest rates have been increased on 6 separate occasions, and the current rate of interest is now 133%. And I don't think you'd be surprised to see that means that Argentina is sitting right at the top of the G20 in terms of its rate of interest. The country with the next highest interest rate is Turkey at 30%, followed by Russia at 13%, Brazil at 12.75%, Mexico at 11.25%, South Africa at 8.25%, and India at 6.5%. All of the other countries in the G20 have interest rates of 6% or lower. And if we look at all of the countries in the world, the only country with a higher rate of interest than Argentina is Zimbabwe, which has an official rate of interest of 150%. And you won't be surprised to hear that the Zimbabwe economy is in a state of complete chaos, having collapsed a number of years ago. The country with the next highest rate of inflation after Argentina is Venezuela at 55%, followed by Ghana and Turkey at 30%, Sudan at 28%, and Congo at 25%. And once again, this really puts the scale of the problems in Argentina into perspective and tells us that the usual practice of increasing interest rates to try to tackle inflation simply isn't working in Argentina, predominantly as a result of the fact that a lot of the economy has been dollarized, so many people in Argentina are using the US dollar rather than the Argentine peso, and so movements in the official rate of inflation for the peso are not really having any impact on that part of the economy, which is the lion's share. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation for the Argentine peso against the US dollar over the course of the last 5 years. And as we've talked about previously, when you look at exchange rate charts, the usual way of showing them is that you present the strongest currency first. So in this case, we are showing the US dollar against the peso. And therefore, the rising line from left to right on this chart indicates a strengthening of the dollar and a weakening of the peso. And the reason I want to go back 5 years is really to show the acceleration in the decline in the value of the peso that's been seen since the start of 2022. 5 years ago, $1 US was trading for around 40 Argentine pesos. Today, the official rate is $1 for 350 pesos, which represents a fall in value of around 9 times over the last 5 years. However, if we look at the situation since the start of 2022, at that point, the official rate was $1 to 100 pesos, which means that in the last 18 months or so, the peso has fallen in value by more than 3.5 times. And the fall in the value of the peso is a major problem for Argentina because it's a net importer. This chart shows Argentina's balance of trade, which is basically the difference between the value of all of your imports and the cost of all of your exports. And you can see that in every one of the last 8 months, the cost of Argentina's imports has been significantly higher than the value of its exports. And when the value of your currency is falling in the international markets, it makes things relatively more expensive because a barrel of oil is generally priced in US dollars. So putting that into the context of the movements in the peso that we've just talked about, over the course of the last 18 months, the cost of a barrel of oil has increased by 3.5 times just based solely on the value of the peso. But actually, the situation is far worse than that because the official rate of inflation doesn't reflect the real exchange rate of the peso. This chart shows the black market exchange rate between the Argentine peso and the US dollar and is often referred to as the blue dollar exchange rate. And as you can see, the current blue dollar exchange rate is $1 US to 900 Argentine pesos, so almost 3 times higher than the official rate. So putting that into the context of the loss of purchasing power of the peso, we're talking about a drop of around 10 times over the last 18 months. And once again, this really puts into perspective the severe problems happening in Argentina right now. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video firstly to bring you up to speed as to what's happening in Argentina, and secondly to talk about the presidential election. And as we've seen from today's video, inflation is now completely off the charts. When you've got inflation above 100%, it's a problem. But there is now talk about inflation hitting 200% in Argentina. And that means that Argentina is now rapidly heading towards the concept of hyperinflation, where inflation and prices are literally increasing on a daily basis. I'm sure you've seen videos in the past of people walking into shops with huge wads of cash to buy a loaf of bread in countries such as Zimbabwe. Well, the situation in Argentina is not far away from being at that level. And that's one of the main reasons why a lot of the people in Argentina have abandoned the Argentine peso, because the value is deteriorating at such a rapid rate. And there is now a really high level of dollarization. And that's one of the reasons why Javier Milei has put forward the concept of scrapping the peso entirely, because he's fully aware that the people in Argentina have lost faith in its currency. You don't want to be paid in pesos or to be holding your life savings in pesos if the value is falling by 10 or 15% per month, because that just means that you've got less cash to spend and that your net worth is diminishing rapidly. So that's why there's been a wholesale move to the dollar. And actually, I don't think that Javier Milei's concept of scrapping the peso is that crazy. If you look at other countries that have done that, such as Ecuador and El Salvador, it actually hasn't had a very damaging effect on their economy. They've performed better once everybody knows exactly where they are. But one of the problems that you will have if you scrap your own currency is that you no longer have control over what's happening in your economy. And that's why Javier Milei is also saying that he's going to scrap the Argentine central bank. Because once you've scrapped your currency, the role of the central bank has been diminished severely. And it's unlikely that Argentina is going to be issuing any bonds at any point in the near future, because they've defaulted on all of their debt. So in terms of the outcome of the presidential election, it looks likely as it stands right now that Javier Milei may be voted in as the next president, and he's going to be quite a controversial character. As well as scrapping the peso and the central bank, he's also got lots of ideas with regards to gun laws and abortion and quite a lot of other controversial topics. So I think we're going to be hearing quite a lot from this guy and also about what's going on in Argentina. And I think this is going to be a really fascinating case study to see whether or not extreme policies can bring Argentina back from the brink. If you look back in history, 100 years ago, Argentina was one of the biggest economies in the world. They were a major player. But over the course of the last 30 to 40 years, things have gone badly wrong. And in order to try to rebuild its position, it needs some radical ideas. But whether or not they will work really remains to be seen. And it will be really interesting to follow the course of Argentina's economy over the course of the next 6 to 12 months if Javier Milei does take control and does bring in all of these different radical ideas. So I'll keep you posted on what happens in Argentina, and I'm looking forward to taking you on that journey. And hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.